Welcome. This is a meeting of the 5th Management Plans Work Group, the Municipal Subgroup. Thank you all for being here. For those of you who are here in the audience, do feel free to come sit at the table. This is an open group. We encourage everyone to come join us. I do have Amanda over here on the side does have a handheld microphone in case anyone in the back does have any comments or anything. We have a webinar running, so please just make sure that if you are going to make a comment that you speak into the microphone, and also identify yourself for the benefit of those on the webinar. My name is Natalie Mast. I'm the program manager working on management plans here at ADWR. I think I know most of you at this point. We today are talking about municipal BMPs under the non-per capita program, and hopefully it'll be an interesting meeting. We do have some ADWR staff here that I'll go ahead and introduce quickly. McKenna Welsh, as always, is in the back running our webinar, so thank you to her. And at the table, we also have Einav Henninson, who's the AMA director. Caitlin Parker is our municipal planner for the AMAs. So those of you who are associated with cities or providers, she's your annual report person. And next to her is Kyle Miller, who's the AMA data and planning manager. And then on my right is Kelly Brown. She's one of our attorneys here at the department, and Carol Ward, who is the Deputy Assistant Director of Planning and Permitting. And I always stumble over that title. Thank you all for being here. We do appreciate you all being here to participate today. We're going to do just a quick kind of overview recap of where we are, what we've done in this subgroup so far, and then we're going to dive right back into the work we were doing last meeting, which is working through each of those individual BMPs and kind of having a conversation about each one and whether there are any revisions to those individual BMPs that we should be considering. We want to kind of think about whether these BMPs are still serving their purpose, whether there should be some restructuring in this program. We have heard some ideas floating around about changing the categories and how we consider those categories. We're not going to get too far into that today, but we'll kind of keep that in mind as we continue working through these individual BMPs. We did receive pretty extensive feedback on the 4th management plan related to some of these BMPs. Some of those were incorporated into the Phoenix 4th management plan and the Pinal draft 4th management plan that was just published on Friday. So we'll continue kind of carrying some of those edits forward, but there were additional points of feedback that we wanted to have conversations about in this group. So we'll be getting to a couple of those. There's a couple places on the slides where we talk about proposals that we've already heard from stakeholders. So you may notice, too, we are making an effort to put a little bit more detail on our agendas. We publish these agendas about a week ahead of time and also include a brief description of what we'll be talking about in the meeting in the reminder email for each meeting. So please do take a look at those. We're trying to allow you to be a little more prepared for these meetings. We're hoping to have some good, productive conversations here. Okay. So the program that we're talking about today, I think most of you were probably at that last meeting, so I'm not going to spend much time here. We are talking about the non-per capita conservation program. This is a best management practices program for large providers in the AMAs and is the kind of default option for non-designated large providers. If designated providers would like to be in this program, then there's a process by which they can elect to join that program. The BMPs are broken up into 7 categories. Again, we have heard some feedback on these particular categories that it might be worth reconsidering these categories or restructuring them. That is something that we'll dedicate some time to in a future meeting. So we're just kind of acknowledging that, and we'll come back to that another time. So what we want to do, at the last meeting, we basically worked through the first 3 categories. So the public awareness, conservation, education, and outreach categories here. So we're hoping to try to make it through these last 4 categories today. So we're going to go ahead and dive right into that. Does anybody have any questions before we kind of dive into the individual BMPs? No? All right. Great. So starting with Category 4. So Category 4 is physical system evaluation and improvement. What we're going to do here is work again through each individual BMP. We'll talk about each BMP, the points that are assigned to it. We just want to consider whether the points that are assigned to it and the language in the BMP itself is correct, or whether we should be considering thinking about this in any different way, recategorizing it, or considering removing that BMP, et cetera. Any changes associated with these BMPs is what we want to discuss on these items. So there was a handout at the sign-in table that'll make it a little bit easier. I know the text on this slide is a little bit small. The handout at the sign-in table contains the same text. This is an example from the Phoenix 4th Management Plan. So what you see on the screen should match largely what's in the Phoenix 4th Management Plan. So the first one we're going to look at today is 4.1. This is a distribution system leak detection program. In the Phoenix 4th Management Plan, we assigned this item 2 points. Maybe the title of that is clear enough, that it's a leak detection type of program. The results of this program would need to be noted in the CER, and perhaps that's an area where we could, in the 5th Management Plan, provide a little bit more detail. What do we mean by results? I'd like to hear from you all. Does anybody use this? Does anybody have any thoughts on this particular program? Do we have any questions or feedback on this particular item? Oh, could you? Yep.
My first question would be, is you're saying this already exists in the Phoenix AMA already?
Right, and this was, I believe this was an existing one previously. So this was one that was carried over from the 3rd Management Plan, but the paper that you're holding is an example from the Phoenix 4th Management Plan.
Whether it be through ADWR or other municipalities, it would be helpful for the smaller communities in Canal maybe to see their examples on how they're doing this. I'm not really sure. I mean, for me, I've been monitoring now for 4 straight years, and it seems like it moves around. And even though we have old meters and are replacing them now with, obviously, the new AMI system, I'd be curious to see how much more consistent our numbers are from year to year. It seems like every year, and we went to that workshop on this exact thing, so we're very well aware of it, but it seems like, are we trying to reduce the amount of leakage, or are we trying to get points for fixing the leaks? I mean, is there a number that we're trying to get down to every year?
So I think in terms of the number, I don't think there's a target associated with this BMP outside of the standard 10% lost and unaccounted for water. My understanding of this BMP is that it's an identification of the physical location of leaks.
Okay, so in order for us to get points
Dina,
for this,
do you want to? Sorry.
I was just going to say that I'm Dina Burns with the City of Chandler. We do use this as one of our BMPs, and so we have ultrasound leak detection program, and so we bring in a contractor that evaluates certain portions of our city year over year, and then we get a report from that. If anything does come up as a potential, then we go out and we verify whether or not there is in fact a leak or if it was some other noise that was being picked up. But if there is a leak, we make the repair, and then we note that for the report.
Great. Thank you for that. Does that help?
Well, I'm going to get her card at the end of the meeting.
Fair enough.
I guess to try to, like I said, some of these, unfortunately, I know that some of our backgrounds are all different. For me as an engineer, I want to understand the final, I guess, measurable and how we're doing it, not just sometimes I get these, what the goal is, and like, how are we trying to accomplish that? So that'll be great for me to kind of better understand how other people are doing it.
And that's a helpful perspective, too, in considering what we require in terms of reporting around these BMPs.
I agree.
There's probably room for improvement there with this particular BMP in terms of clarifying what it is that the deliverable there is.
I wasn't trying to be critical.
No, that's what we're here for. Perfect. Mr. Snyder?
Thank you, David Snyder, Pinell AMA. You asked a question about a key measure that I think would be instructive for all of us as we're walking through these things, which is how many uses are there? How many municipal users actually use these BMPs? And we have no indication. So if it's 80% of them are using this particular BMP, then that speaks to, the desirability, the ease, and so on and so forth. Whether or not it's effective is another issue. But those number counts, those head counts would be helpful for everybody, I think.
Sure. And we did include a chart of that in our last meeting on this topic. I don't think I have it in the slides today. What we found with those counts, though, is there are a bunch reported in the first few categories and then almost none reported in the last few categories, not necessarily because we don't think people are doing the BMPs in those last few categories, but our assumption there is more that people report up to the point target that they need to get to, and then they don't report on any additional BMPs because they don't need to.
And what does that tell you?
It tells us that our data there is not good. So that's something that we want to consider throughout this process that we can improve on and then get a better understanding of the actual utilization of these various BMPs and the outcomes from the various BMPs.
Thank you for those of us who believe in science. That'd be good data.
Yeah. Thanks. Okay. There's
I missed the last one, but could you just give us a quick concept of how you decide the points?
So it's a good question. And a lot of the rationale around the points was the points were assigned for the for these remaining 3 forest management plans, kind of on feedback that we received and also kind of an evaluation of the BMP itself. So what we wanted to do was give additional points to those BMPs that either are particularly difficult or resource intensive to implement, or those that might be seen as having the highest conservation type of impact. So the actual evaluation there is a little bit squishy and can certainly be a topic of conversation. So this item has 2 points assigned to it.
So just so I know, and again, I apologize because I wasn't at the last meeting. So what's the maximum number of points that a BMP can get?
I think it's 3. And that is not a hard and fast cap. That was just kind of where we landed with the fourth management plan. That is certainly something that as we're assessing both the points for the individual BMPs and what the points targets should be for the fifth management plans, that's something that we can kind of assess in an ongoing way. Okay. Any other questions or comments on item 4.1? Okay. All right, we'll go ahead and move on to the next one. Item 4.2 is meter repair or replacement program. This item is worth 2 points and is just what it sounds like. Again, a program to repair or replace old or malfunctioning, just malfunctioning meters within the service area. And the metric here is reporting the number of meters repaired or replaced each year. Does anybody have any questions or comments or thoughts on this particular BMP? I know this is something that a lot of systems kind of do as a matter of course. All right. We'll go ahead and...
I'm sorry. Chris Ellis, Town of Florence. So this doesn't necessarily, I mean, the way that I always thought it was just replacement, but it's also meters repaired. So there's a system for testing the, because obviously I assume most municipalities and or private water service providers do some type of typical bucket test when they have a complaint. They have some kind of system to be able to go back to the customer and say that yours is well within the range and it's operating correctly. So it's, what would be the criteria then for just, is it more of just the program itself that we have a program than the replacement of meters is, again, it's just a program, so you could do this every year?
I think the idea here is some kind of a structured program rather than just a more scattershot response to complaint type approach. That's at least my understanding of this particular one, is that it's supposed to be a systematic evaluation, perhaps a cycle, and maybe that's a place where we need to clarify that language.
Well, we're not. No, we're definitely not, and that would again affect staffing levels and what have you. So yeah, I guess then for us to better understand that, then we want to have an understanding of what level proactivity means. I mean, is it 10%? Is it 5%? Is it 2%? It's definitely not 100%. Not pulling every meter in a community. So again, you asked an engineer. So. As far as what you guys are doing, right? But not necessarily the, okay.
So just for an example, so City of Chandler, we have an active program for our high volume meters, and we have a third party come in and test all of our high volume meters every year. So we don't do, it's not a residential program, it's for our commercial large volume users. All of the larger meters are tested every year to make sure that we're capturing all of that flow.
That's very good.
So, Natalie, I'm just curious why, Heather Turrentine from Gilbert, why we're giving this one 2 points. To me, this really seems like it's just a kind of integral part of good utility management, and I think that that's going to be a drive in and of itself for providers to comply with that. And, I'm thinking of some of the, like the Tier 1 who would only need, 3 points. This could be 66% of that, and they wouldn't be, it would discourage them from implementing more conservation programs just because they're already doing good utility management.
Good feedback. That's definitely something we want to consider as a part of this, is whether the assigned points values are the correct values. Okay. All right, we can go ahead and move on to the next item. Item 4.3 is an approved comprehensive water system audit program. So maybe in the subtext of that kind of complicated title there is the intent of this BMP was to provide points for a program like M36 that is a comprehensive water audit analysis of the system. So we wanted to make it general enough that it wouldn't have to be just M36. If there's other audit type programs out there that might fit that criteria, we wanted to leave it open for those types of things. But the kind of the way this BMP originated was wanting to account for a program like M36. And this one, in recognition of kind of the extensive and resource-intensive nature of that type of program, we did assign this item 3 points. Any questions, comments, thoughts here? This one's good. This one, I believe, was a new one for the Phoenix Fourth Management Plan as well, and will be carried through to the Fifth Management Plans and to those other 2 remaining Fourth Management Plans, Pinal and Santa Cruz. Okay, item 4.4 is, is installation of advanced metering infrastructure. I think you mentioned this briefly, Chris. So advanced metering infrastructure, smart meters, that kind of thing. This item does have 2 points, kind of in recognition of it being a best new technology item, and includes the provider installing or retrofitting advanced meter reading into an advanced metering infrastructure. And maybe I'm not the best person to talk about this because I'm not an engineer. This item is worth 2 points, though. Are there any questions, comments on this particular item? John?
John Munderlow, Town of Prescott Valley. I see that it's just installation for a period of 5 years. We've been working on the retrofit for a number of years, and the key component that we haven't implemented yet is the software to bring it all together so that our customers can dial in, see what their water use is in real time, and so that we have real time, leak notifications and customer inquiry resolution and all of that stuff. So what I'm saying is, the purchase and maintenance and ongoing use of that software is fairly expensive, and I think that's really where the conservation of advanced metering comes in. So what I'm saying is that I propose that it's installation and maintenance of the advanced metering infrastructure, and then it should be for more than 5 years. It should be an ongoing BMP.
Okay. So would you propose that we just add maintenance into this BMP, or would that be a separate item?
I don't know or really probably care, but well, whatever anybody wants to talk about here.
Okay. No, that's interesting.
Natalie, David Snyder, Pinal AMA. Just to channel Chris a little bit, so if John has the installation, then John gets the points regardless of whether or not it actually works and provides benefit. I think that's kind of sort of what I heard.
John again. Yeah, we've installed maybe 60, 70% of our system now with these FlexNet meters is the brand we're with. And they're neat for meter reading, but we haven't implemented really any conservation techniques associated with that yet. So the software that we're about ready to purchase will bring that together, make it available for our customers, and be a new thing. Otherwise, they're no different than the radio receiver, truck-mounted things. It saves us some cost. And I like it. I mean, you should incentivize people towards this, right? And so this is good, the installation, driving towards installation. But then after that, the ongoing maintenance and implementation of that in the high-tech world is, I think, really where you're going to see the conservation driver.
That's good feedback. Thank you. Okay. Heather?
I think it's good that the points are associated with the installation because then you're not you're giving instant positive feedback for getting on the track for AMI, and once you have the AMI installed, I mean, I'm on a conservation team. There's no way I wouldn't want to access that data once that was installed, and I know our operations team would want to stay on top of that. To me, that BMP is more about just incentivizing putting it in place. And then I also kind of question a little bit of the language of how it's worded, because to me it reads as, you know, someone could install 20 AMI meters as a pilot and get credit for this for 5 years for 10 total points, which would seem like a lot if they just did a small amount of AMI meters.
Thank you. Okay. Good feedback. Anyone else on this item? Okay. Let's go ahead and move on to Category 5 then. Category 5 is ordinances, conditions of service, and tariffs. This particular category is supposed to be designed to reduce water use in a service area by reducing the water used for specific, very specific purposes. And I know this particular category is one that the private water providers have struggled with a little bit. There is a provision that says a water provider that is not a part of a municipality can receive credit if it works with local or county jurisdictions to implement a new ordinance. So there is kind of a framework, at least, there for those of you who are associated with the private water providers. So the first item on this list, 5.1, is low water use landscaping requirements. And this is given 1 point for those who adopt it. Any questions, comments, thoughts on these items? Okay.
These are very specific with the ordinances, but I'm wondering, would it make sense to have an option for the linking of land use and water use ordinances to be in there?
So can you maybe say a little bit more?
You have assigned land uses that have an attached water allocation that goes with that. If you have a user that's coming into your city that wants to use in excess of that water allocation that has already been determined by the city, that they would have to come up with some kind of mechanism to either bring in additional water or that they're bringing in a specific economic value or something where you're actually having an ability to limit excessive water uses within your water providing service area.
Yeah, so I think that would need to be a new BMP unless there's one that I'm missing that. Yeah, I think that's a new one. That's a good idea, though, Dina. We can definitely maybe work on putting together some language for that and see what we can do with that.
And down in Casa Grande, they're doing the same thing. They want to build it into their general land use plan. They want to connect it up with the allocation of supplies. Great. And I think they are looking at your model as the one. So I would agree that'd be a great one to add.
Natalie, David Snyder from Canal AMA again. As I was looking at this, again, I'm curious to know, is there a target? I mean, these are pretty open-ended. Just as long as you can say you've got it in place, you're under no obligation to actually do anything that is conserving more. And private water providers are, as you know, very, very limited on what they can do. They don't have those kinds of gubernatorial or administrative powers that cities and counties do. So looking at targets, at least talking about them, whether you put them in a separate BMP as was just discussed, or somehow incorporating it with this one would be helpful. As Terry Sue said, particularly as municipalities and counties are going through their land use plans, and as they do every 10 years for revisions. Developing water resource plans are very much looming on that in that process.
Thanks, David, and I think that's well taken and maybe kind of fits in this theme that we've been having kind of recurring with a lot of these BMPs is what's our measurement here, what's our metric? So it's a good point.
Natalie?
That comes from
me, McKenna, in the back. Hey, we have a comment online from Adria Sarovi from the City of Scottsdale. She says, ordinances are fantastic, but only if they have enforcement, which there are no requirements for reporting on the enforcement.
And also a good point. Thank you, Adria. Okay. So it sounds like this category might need a more full assessment of both the language and the criteria for earning those points. And perhaps that's something that we approach kind of through that process of considering these categories as a whole. Maybe it would be something like a maximum number of points that could come from this category. There might be a few different ways that we could approach something along those lines. Okay.
I have a general question.
Sure.
I believe I was online for the first meeting. We were talking about all the BMPs, and I think there was only three different subgroups where everyone had to fit in based on the amount of essentially connections they had.
The number
That's correct.
Right.
So I liken this back to when I was part of CAG, and I was with the city of Maricopa, and so we were one along with Casa Grande that were the two big fish. But then there were the Winklemans and the Mammoths and the Miamis. So there were the haves and the have-nots. And so for a community of 585,000, comparing that to a community of 26,000, questionable. Is three categories really enough to create the separation needed if we're trying to, I guess, do a better job? Because it seems like that's a lot of steps between. And I do like the idea of encouraging. I don't think that, by no means am I trying to sit there and say that, because it seems like there's some of us are taking the approach of how do we score our points, and there's some of us are taking a big picture look of what we're trying to accomplish by water conservation. I think Florence is probably going to be one that's sort of in between those two, where we're needing to get, our points, and how do we do that with current staffing levels and not necessarily either reallocating or hiring more and then raising our rates to meet these. But I just think that maybe that three categories is not quite enough to compare us to, again, much larger or even smaller communities in Florence. It would seem like these things are going to take staffing and time.
There we are. That's definitely a fair point, and maybe that's something that we'll need to put on the agenda for a future meeting as we're talking about restructuring these categories. Perhaps we need to reevaluate the tier assignments as well. Get back to where we were. Okay. So maybe we can kind of run through some of these pretty quickly because, again, they are pretty specific, and there's probably more to be said kind of in a general way about ordinances. Does anybody have any comments on items here that maybe could be combined or removed, or perhaps there's a more general way to talk about some of these that might allow simplification in this category? Does anybody have any questions or thoughts on this particular category as a whole? We're kind of on all of 5.
So Heather and Gilbert, I see the potential for the low water use landscaping requirements and the water efficient landscape requirements in model homes to potentially be combined. They come from a similar heart, and I think that you could put that language together and combine that. It would just be a matter of then how many points overall do you want to go to that in sum.
So I'm imagining you did some studies that told you that car washes were really big water users, and that's how that ended up here. Is it possible that we could play conservation for maybe not be so specific and make it targeting the high water users in your area, because maybe car washes aren't really your deal?
And to that point, if that was the case, we'd have a section on mortuaries, believe it or not. Very high water using.
So we can certainly consider or look at ways that we might make that language more general. Yeah.
Natalie, David Snyder, again from LIMA. As I look at the array of issues that are covered in 5, it occurs to me that these are to an earlier discussion. These are more metropolitan than they are medium to small sized water utilities and communities. I mean, you've parsed this out to a large extent and touching water fountains and car washes and so on and so forth, whereas in a number of communities in the AMAs, it's stuff that you just blow by because it's not appropriate. So, in the interest of reducing paperwork.
So, are there specific items or new items we could add here that might be more relevant for those smaller communities? What type of thing might be?
I would not suggest adding. I would suggest subtracting.
Okay.
And perhaps that could be done by adding a population measurement.
So the number of points that a provider has to achieve is determined by the number of their connections. So that's kind of already built in here. What I might imagine is where you're saying some of these BMPs work better in a larger community. Are there examples of this type of thing that would fit better for a small community, so it would provide an opportunity for those smaller communities to get something in this category? That's kind of what I meant by adding something there. And I don't know what that would be. That's a genuine question.
I'm not sure I'm prepared to speak to that at present, but I'm confident that in this great state of ours and in the AMAs, you will get responses.
Which of these is applicable to conditions of service and tariffs? I can see which ones are applicable to ordinances, but I'm wondering which ones do you see as conditions of service and tariffs?
off again. It's a good question, and that's something we might need to follow up on. I'm maybe not familiar enough with that structure there.
Because I would argue that certainly tariffs, I'm assuming you mean by that rates, that having, you know, a water conservation ordinance or water conservation oriented rate structure would be an important part. I'm assuming you want everybody to do that. Maybe it's in a different category.
Thank you, Teresa. Okay. All right. So I think maybe this category is one that is going to need a little bit of work. We certainly would welcome additional feedback from you all regarding whether there should be additional items in this category, whether we should rework this category entirely. It kind of sounds like some of the strategy on this particular category might need to change. Good. Okay. Let's see. So this is still in category 5. I think we'll go ahead and move on. Yes. Yes. And sorry, Tracy, there was a handout with everything at the sign-in table too. So safe watering restrictions. Yeah, let's go ahead and just move on here to the next category. Category 6 is rebates and incentives. What we've heard in some of the feedback that we got on the fourth management plan is that it would be good to split out residential and non-residential. So in category 6, we have a residential section and a non-residential section. We have heard that it would be helpful to do more of that kind of splitting and defining of where things apply to residential type applications or non-residential type applications, and perhaps the points targets for those different applications are different because of the kind of resource intensity differences there and the conservation impact differences there. So just something to consider as we work through this. We are in the residential portion of category 6 under rebates and incentives. So again, this is the items in this category are intended to provide some kind of incentive for implementing some conservation practice, whether that be more efficient technologies, appliances, toilets, that kind of thing, or whether it be practices. So we do have on 6.1, this first one here is a customer assistance program where the provider would offer services or no interest loans, low or no interest loans to repair inefficient equipment and leaks. The items required for reporting here for the CER include the number of customers assisted, the type of repair, and the actual water savings that might be seen from that type of repair. Does anybody have any questions or comments on this particular item? No? All right. Item 6.2 is similar, but is specifically focused on toilets, offering a financial rebate for the purchase and installation of water-efficient toilets, defined as 1.6 gallons or less per flush.
My brow is really wrinkled here. If I understand this correctly, we are talking about utilities being in the finance business, offering low-interest loans and other financial incentives for homes to either retrofit or for developers to put in these sorts of things. If it's in an incorporated area, those are things given to the municipality to require through zoning and so on and so forth. And I'm puzzled. I would be hard-pressed to think that there's a utility that's going to say, oh, yeah, we're going to go into the low-interest loan business. I don't see it happening. To start with, yeah. And now we're talking rebates down in 5.3, rebates in 6.3, and so on and so forth. Are you doing it as the utility or? Yeah. You see my point?
Yes, understood. Actually, this is Carol Ward. There are utilities that are doing 6.1. City of Phoenix has had since the 1980s a customer assistance program in place. They've retrofitted, I believe it's over 200,000 low-income residences, and there have been many utilities across the United States that have done that, and many utilities continue to do that. Utilities vary across the United States in terms of what they're interested in doing. So it is an option. I mean, it's not one that every utility is interested in, but it's an option. More often than not, you see 6.2 implemented. There are quite a number of incentive programs, rebate programs. Those tend to be more popular.
Chris Alls, Town of Florence. I guess I'm not sure if this is for the attorney, but are these, let's just say for the City of Phoenix, is that paid for out of their rate study and their utility fees? Is that the general fund picking those costs up?
No, that would come out of the utility. And that would be, that ends up actually reducing costs of the utility in the long run, because you're replacing old and inefficient fixtures. So if you're going in and you're replacing old toilets that are, 6 gallons per flush, or, maybe they're not even, that old at this point. But if you're replacing old and inefficient fixtures, then you are, increasing the overall efficiency of your system. And that in turn is creating, lowered cost for your utility. So you're actually becoming more efficient. You're lowering the cost for your customers overall. So conservation in the long run, as I think most of you are aware, that conservation in the long run lowers your costs and lowers your rates in the long run. City of Tucson and Town of Gilbert were recently involved in some studies that showed the avoided costs to the utility of conservation. So increased efficiency lowers the long-term cost to your customers. So there's a benefit there. So the City of Phoenix and other utilities see that investment in efficiency and replacing those fixtures as an investment, so that they offset the cost of, to the utility in the long run. They don't have to acquire additional supplies, and they're actually saving in the long run. And, I don't know if Heather wants to speak to that at all, but they definitely saw benefit at Gilbert.
So perhaps we move on to item 6.3 here, Smart Irrigation Technology Rebate or Incentive Program. So this is an incentive or a rebate for the installation of smart irrigation, so outdoor water use here. And the information included on the CER is documentation of the number and type rebated, what the benefit there might be, and actual water savings per year associated with that. Any questions, comments here? The next item on the list, 6.4, is a rebate for water-efficient hot water devices or systems. Something we did here in our process for the Phoenix Fourth Management Plan was that possibly we should remove this particular BMP because it is not as effective in terms of water savings as compared to those rebates that might focus more on outdoor water use. Are there any thoughts or comments there? Perhaps there could be a strategy here of combining some of the indoor water use type items.
Go ahead. Heather with Gilbert. I'm glad that you mentioned that. I was actually going to wait till we got to the next one, the water efficient appliance rebate, which comes in at 2 points. I think it would be smart to limit the total amount of points you can get from indoor rebates. I'm looking at the toilet rebate, which is a great effort, but I could see someone getting 1 point under the toilet rebate BMP, and then also kind of stretching that definition to fall under the water efficient appliance. I think of appliance as just a device or equipment that helps us perform a specific task. So I could see someone scoping that if they wanted to and getting 3 points for a toilet rebate program, which I think would be too many. So I like the idea of combining those indoor rebates.
Okay.
Melody Lawyer. The on-demand, it may, with a lot of areas having hard water, it might also add equipment in the house that might add to water waste, such as, or other issues with salt related to water softeners. If you have hard water, those on-demand units may fail sooner, and people tend to put in water softeners on their houses.
Thanks. Okay. Any other questions, comments? Okay. Go. Whoops. I clicked on something I shouldn't have. What did I do? There it goes. Okay. Item 6.5, gray water retrofit rebate or incentive program. So this is some kind of a financial rebate or incentive for the installation of gray water systems or retrofits. And again, reporting is the type and number of the rebates, the total amount rebated per appliance, and the water savings. Any questions, comments here? Oh, maybe my numbering is off here. Oh, yeah. Oh, there it is. Yep. Okay. 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 So we'll go by the numbering on the slide just for the purpose of conversation. So the item on the slide that I was looking at was 6.6. In the handout, it's listed as 6.5. The next item, 6.7 or 6.6 on your handout, rainwater harvesting retrofit is maybe a little bit similar, where it's some kind of rebate or incentive for using water that would otherwise be lost or go down the drain for the purposes of outdoor landscaping. John?
Can I go back to gray water?
Sure.
This is John Munderlow, Town of Prescott Valley. I almost think that it's not a water savings if you have a wastewater collection, treatment, and recharge system, that using gray water outside would in fact probably reduce your overall conservation in your system.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. Okay, so the next item on the list is landscape conversion rebate or incentive program. So this would fall under a conservation incentive for outdoor water uses, converting landscapes to low water use or xeriscape type landscape. Any questions, comments about this particular item? Okay. The next item is similar, 6.8 on the handout or 6.9 on the slide, installing xeriscapes in new landscapes. So perhaps these two could be combined. One is a conversion rebate, and one is a new installation for probably new homes, new builds, for those two items. Any questions, comments on the landscape conversion or new installation there, Dina?
My only concern with combining those two is on the new installation xeriscape. It's very hard to measure that if they didn't have a landscape. So if you merge them, it might make it harder to get the true measures on those, because one has to be an estimate, whereas the other one you would have some actual.
Fair enough. Thanks, Gina. Okay. The next set here, we're now looking at non-residential rebates or incentives. So the first item, 610 on the slide, is commercial and industrial rebate or incentive program. So this is where the provider identifies commercial and industrial users with the highest conservation potential and implements some kind of a conservation program with that particular water user. The CER requires a description of the program and what the water savings is before and after the project. Are there any thoughts or comments on this particular item? Okay. Again, we see a toilet rebate that could perhaps be combined into some kind of an indoor type incentive program, but this is specific to non-residential users.
I'm sorry, actually, I have a question about 610. Sure. If you negotiate something in the development agreement with the non-residential user for them to install low water use landscaping or processes in their operations, would that qualify under 610, do you think?
I think if it was installing, so if it's installing low water use landscape, that might be under 616, which isn't on this slide, it would be on the next slide. Or perhaps a large landscape conservation program, which is 617 on the handout. I think it would maybe depend on the details there, which BMPs might apply there.
Right, so this would be, these are programs here. I'm talking about, is there something where, like, as you bring in new large industrial users, you sit down with them and you negotiate through their development agreement everything they're required to do in order to be as water efficient as possible, as opposed to a program that says, you're doing this for everybody. But I'm saying as they come in, is Maybe there's something else on this list that it would fit into.
There might be something, depending on the details there, that would fit on the existing list, but maybe to Dina's earlier point, maybe that would be something that would fit better under a new BMP that was doing something like tying land and water use together. That might be something that might better fit under a new BMP. So helpful, thank you. Okay, 6. It looks like there's a few outdoor water use type things here. So 612 here is smart irrigation technology rebate. And we also have a large landscape conservation program. So there might be a few different items here that either could be adjusted or considered to be combined, depending on the details there. Does anybody have any thoughts about maybe combining a few of these for focusing on indoor use, focusing on outdoor use? Any questions or comments about that? No? All right. Let's go ahead and move on. So we do have, so 613 on the slide is, we have 613 on the slide and, goodness, I'm getting this mixed up. 614 on the slide and 613 on our page is gray water, and then the following one is rainwater harvesting retrofit rebate or incentive. Maybe similar thoughts on those two items under non-residential as under residential, where maybe those should be reconsidered in the context of effluent. Any thoughts there? Questions? Okay. All right. We do have item number 616 on the slide is a landscape conversion rebate or incentive program. So this is, this one and the next one are kind of similar again to what was under the residential program, where we have one for conversions and one for new installs on new landscapes. Any questions or comments on those two items? Okay. Item number 618 is a large landscape conservation program, where with some coordination with the customer, there is a program put in place to increase landscape water use efficiency. I don't know that I know of any examples of this one.
Okay. I know Town of Gilbert initiated this, but there's programs where we create water budgets and we alert the large landscape users as to when they're exceeding their water budget so that they can get out there right away and address any problems that are occurring that are causing that overuse.
Thanks, Gina.
I have a question. Crystal, Town of Florence. We're talking about no or low interest loans for non-residential. Mm-hmm. How is that not a gift clause? I'm being serious. I'm confused on that.
That's a fair question. Something that we can follow up on. So perhaps that would be one that might need to be removed. Okay. All right. So, okay. So the next category, I would like to point out as we get into this category, the next category here, we did receive a proposal to kind of streamline and restructure this particular category a little bit. What we'll do is we'll run through the individual BMPs in this category, and then we do have a slide kind of with the, some of the details of that particular proposal that we received, so we can talk about that. Category 7 is research and innovation. So item 7.1 that we're looking at here is participation in industry or regional partnerships for water conservation. Any questions or comments here? Okay. Item 7.2 is research of a new technology or technique. Yeah. And the CER documentation just describes research objectives, methods, and results. Any questions, comments here? Okay. Item 7.3 is a pilot plan development. Oh.
So if a municipality wants to do that, is it required to get a pre-approval before they start into that?
I don't believe so. No, it would just provide some documentation of involvement and any other participatory involvement. So no, it would not need pre-approval for that. Okay. Item 7.3 is pilot plan development for new technology or technique. So this would be testing out some new conservation technology or methodology. Questions, comments? Okay.
So what's the difference between 7.1 and 7.3 exactly?
Between 7.1 and 7.3? Mm-hmm. So, so I think 7.3 happened here. Sorry. I think 7.3 is more focused on methodologies and techniques, where 7.1 is more of a regional collaboration, maybe associated with a regional partnership. I'm trying to think of the example here, and I'm spacing on the name.
With the city of Phoenix and ASU doing their, I forget what the name of it is, hydrogel, the little pellets they're injecting there. So that then, where's that fitting in this? I mean, I'm not sure it's a pilot plan, but I assume it's 7.1. But it's new, so is it then 7.2?
I would guess that because they're actually piloting it, like actually testing it out in a certain space, I would guess that would fall under 7.4, where 7.3 is planning for piloting something. Yeah, there's a lot here. 7.3 is planning to pilot something. 7.4 is actually testing something out, actually piloting a new technology. So I would think that that hydrogel example would fall under 7.4. So perhaps this is why there was a proposal to kind of restructure this particular category. So let's just touch quickly on the next couple here, and we can get to that proposal, and maybe that's something that kind of in looking at the sequence here maybe makes sense to consider in the context of this group. So item 7.5 is an evaluation of new or emerging technologies or practices, which to me kind of seems similar to 7.2. Perhaps if we were going to stick with these BMPs, we could perhaps combine those two. And item 7.6 is analyzing a BMP for actual water savings. So this is maybe a little bit more research oriented, where you're looking, rather than looking at new practices or new potential technologies, this is looking at existing practices and trying to evaluate an actual water savings associated with that practice. Any questions or comments here? Okay. And 7.7 is implementation of a smart irrigation technology. And maybe something that could be clarified on that particular item is how that technology is implemented, how broadly that needs to be implemented. Okay. So,
sorry, Natalie, Heather with Gilbert. On 7.7, while I like that BMP, I'm just wondering how that differs from providing incentives. So, I mean, are we talking about just the provider doing the actual installation of it to qualify for that point? To me, 7.7 kind of also implies that it would be, you'd be gifting the smart irrigation technology and helping them get it installed. It just seems like it's a little fuzzy on how that one's meant to be different from the incentive one.
Fair enough. There might be some overlap there. Okay. Okay. So something we can maybe move on to is we did receive I know this is a little bit hard to read on the screen here, but we did receive a pretty extensive proposal about Category 7, where basically the category would be restructured to more closely follow some thought process around the scientific method. So this category is research and innovation, and the idea here was to structure this kind of along the lines of the process that you see in those types of research. So similar types of BMPs, but would potentially sequence it in a sequence and streamline it in a more intuitive way. Does anybody have any questions or comments, or maybe thoughts on this particular item?
So I'm all for the scientific method. That makes a lot of sense. I'm struggling with how 7.1 is research and innovation. This seems more like maybe it's earlier in the categories, public information program, public awareness. That seems like number 1 really fits under. Like, so I take this to mean if you don't have your own water conservation program, that you can join a regional, public education conservation program. I don't understand how 7.1 is research innovation, but I'm not a water conservation expert, so I'm sure one of you can explain that to me.
And I am not super familiar with how that particular one has been implemented at various cities. Perhaps that's something we can consider combining with something else. Any questions, comments on this thought? Oh, Heather?
So 7.1 could potentially be combined with 1.1, just the local or regional conservation campaign. You could extend, doing your own marketing towards with giving in-kind services to a regional partnership that does marketing. I think of like Water Use It Wisely. Cities that pay into that will often then also reshare a lot of that same messaging. So they kind of go hand in hand.
Okay, great. Okay.
I agree with what Heather's saying. The only question I have, because it's under research and innovation, would be if it's not a communication program, if there's actually a partnership between 2 water providers to implement a new technology by utilizing maybe a smaller sample size, so that if each one can't afford to do it on their own, they partner together to pilot something out. But not a communication program, because I think that is totally covered in 1.1.
Okay. In addition to these BMPs that we've gone through, we do have the opportunity to add additional BMPs, and even kind of outside of the formal management plans process, providers can propose to add a new BMP to that list at any time, and that process is laid out in the management plan. Okay. So moving on. Oh, Chris.
Chris Dolph, Town of Florence. Something that was said very early on by Heather Gilbert was the comment of, you just did this one thing, you get 2/3 of your points, I think, for 5 straight years. I'm paraphrasing. So I think one of the ideas, and I think she also brought it up, was, is it possible, or could it be possible, that a community takes a point for this and a point for this, and it's really one and the same? Is there anything, is there any checks that AWR is going to have that make sure that somebody isn't, I guess, double or triple dipping because of some of these? It almost seems like you could put them in a couple different categories. And I love the idea of this large bushel basket. I do. I'm not trying to limit it. I'm just saying if the intent is to really have water conservation, we don't want people sort of cheating the system. So, like I said, I like all the different categories for the most part, sweeping generality. But I don't want to make sure that someone isn't doing one thing and then counting it in 3 different areas or something, because that obviously does defeat the entire purpose of it.
I appreciate that. I think maybe some of this work that we've discussed in clarifying the language around some of the BMPs would help with some of that, making sure that we're clear about kind of the intent about the specific BMP. So there's some improvement to be made there. Also, where we're identifying that some of the BMPs are just really very similar to each other, combining those, I think some of that will help there in kind of streamlining this and also making sure that people aren't double dipping in that way.
I think that we could, clear up the language, but we have some people with experience at the table, and even some of us are struggling with, like, what is exactly the difference between this or this? Or I said 7-1, 7-2, or 7-3, and then you went 7-4, showing, like, okay. So I'm trying to figure out, like I said, somewhere along the lines, I do think that we want to make sure on the acceptance side that no one is double, whether they're putting in 7-1 or 7-3, as long as they're doing it and the points are equal, I can see, like, who cares? As long as they're doing it, and they're doing it, but they're only counting it once.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And I think maybe another thing that kind of fits in that is we have had some conversation. We've heard some discussion of, so in the Ag BMP program, for example, you have to get at least 1 point from each of the categories. With some nuance there, there's one category where you have to get at least 2 points. So perhaps we could implement something like that here, where depending on the tier, depending on your total points target, you might need to get a certain number of points from specific categories. So there might be a couple different ways to kind of get at that same thing. Go ahead.
Melody Lawyer again. Is it also the case where people are only counting until they get to a certain level, till they meet their goal, and they're leaving out all the other things so that they can take advantage of them later when some goals are only good for 5 years, or you can only count the points for so many years? They're like saving those other points for next time.
Fair enough. I understand what you're saying there. Yeah. Thanks. And it's hard to, given our data quality, it's a little hard to say which is happening. Our assumption has kind of been they report up until the point where they've hit their target and then just stop. So, but there could be some other strategy there, for sure.
Have you guys put together just a little, like a data table that has each of the measures and the points and sum them by categories and totals? And
we have not, but we could do that.
I would like to see something like that. That would be interesting, because I think that the key to this is how each of these things is weighted and what's really important relative to other things.
That's a good idea. Thanks.
since we're bouncing around, Alani Frost with Pinal County, since we're bouncing around, I'll comment back on Section 5.1 under the general category of ordinances and conditions of service. It seems to me that 5.1 only getting 1 point is very low. If you can put together an ordinance or a system where you are requiring all new developments to come in with low water landscaping or other limitations, then you are capturing a huge element of a lot of the other areas that we talked about. And then if, like an entity like Pinal County that has zoning authority and ordinance authority does that, does the private water companies within that jurisdiction get credit for that?
Only if we help.
So the way the language is written, I believe, like Terry Sue said, that if that was done in some kind of collaboration, then the provider would be able to get credit for that. Great.
I just actually had a comment. I was thinking with regards to, we're wondering if people stop tracking their points and such. I guess I had a question and a comment. My question was with regards to holding on to points for later when you can't collect those points. I would think you can only collect those points if you're actually doing that in the year of reporting. So you shouldn't really be holding on to points for later reporting. I would, if I'm understanding that correctly.
So my understanding of that comment is there's certain BMPs that are limited to a single year or maybe 3 years. So it might be the case of those where if you're kind of doing them in an ongoing basis, you might report them in a year that you're shorter on points.
Okay, sure. And then my other thought was, to me, it would make more sense just from a data perspective so that we have a better understanding of where we're actually capturing true water savings. If we just report on everything we're doing, but where there is an actual box or a check mark where we can put that it's a reportable BMP versus an additional BMP.
Heather with Gilbert. So just speaking back to the 5.1 that was brought up, the low water use landscaping. The AMWA cities I know had collectively argued that one be reduced from 2 points to 1 point, and the rationale there was not that this isn't a very effective requirement when it's enforced, but just that the BMP didn't speak to enforcement. So it's one thing to have that requirement in place, and it's a whole other thing to actually be looking at plan reviews and as they come in and really enforcing it. And so the thought process back at AMWA was kind of, well, if it's just going to be the rule and not the enforcement, that's really not that much of an effort for the provider. I mean, it's an overhaul to put that rule in place the first time, but then going forward, it's a freebie continuing on unless they're actually doing enforcement. So I'd just like, enforcement to be considered along with that one, if it at all was considered to raise its point value, especially. 5.1.
The enforcement issue is true of almost all of these, right? So it's not just that one, right?
Great. If I might add, Jackie Keller, if we are spending a lot of time and we are doing a lot of community input to even get ordinances passed, they are enforceable. That's why they're an ordinance. And so I agree with Mr. Pinal here that the larger an entity is, the bigger impact ordinances are going to have. The key would be to try and create a reason for entities to want to do an ordinance in the first place, because that ordinance takes on a lot of hits from everybody around it to pass it and to adopt it as an entity. So if it's not in an ordinance, there is no way to enforce it. The only way to enforce it is to have it in the ordinance. I also have a confusion between the 5.1 and I think it was the 6.6 and 6.16 or something, between xeriscape landscaping and
Category 6 versus water conservation or drought-tolerant landscaping in Category 5, if that's a double dip situation, or Category 6 is for those entities who don't have an ordinance or are not going to do an ordinance, then they can provide some incentives or rebates.
Okay, and that's something we can look into, seeing how those might overlap.
So perhaps one way to improve upon 5.1 and to kind of, address that issue of, it's technically enforceable, but whether or not it's enforced, is just to ask for how many developments perhaps came through and were regulated by this. And, there's a few different ways that you can think that through. I know Gilbert will, when we put out our annual water savings, we report how much water we estimate was saved from our landscaping ordinances. So you could put a measurable target in place there so that if someone was doing this but not enforcing it and then they had to report, well, I don't know, or zero, that would be a red flag. Great.
And I was just going to speak to the overlap between the ordinance and the conversions. I think it could probably be written more clearly, but I think it's your existing landscapes that already have the high water use, and then the ordinance is implemented, and then it's being enforced through the ordinance. I'm sorry, I was really referring to 5.1 versus the new landscapes for 6.8 in their handouts, and which is installing new landscapes, which is the same as an ordinance would be, and 6.16 in the handout. Those are new landscapes and xeriscaping, which is kind of the same as 5.1, I believe. If an entity can achieve getting ordinances in place to be able to enforce it, that is so much broader and long-term than the incentive and rebate. And this is just from the City of Chandler. We actually have an ordinance specific to multifamily and model homes and commercial, but residential we don't. So we have a new rebate for residential. So they are two different things. Right. That's a harder sell.
All right. Terry Sue, and then I think we're going to need to wrap up today. We are running a little short on time.
I was just wondering if you could remind us what's in the statewide Water Efficiency Plumbing Act thing and how that works relative to 6.2. Because the saying here, because I thought nobody could buy a toilet here that was less than one, or that was more than 1.6 gallons.
Okay, so that'll have to be something I follow up on. I'm not sure of the details of that, but perhaps that's perhaps that's something where that gallons number might need to be updated. Great. Okay. So I do just want to remind everybody that this group is a part of the Management Plans Work Group. We do have a meeting of that full work group on, oh goodness, now I'm going to forget the date, March 19th. So that is coming up. We hope to see all of you there. We are working through a process. So the first part of this was to assess the existing conservation programs and update those management strategies. But we also want to consider developing new management strategies as a part of this process. So in this particular group, we're kind of working through that, working through the existing structures and seeing what are the pieces that we can update or edit to make them a little bit more functional, make them work better. But we do also want to, as we move along in this process, consider any potential new or additional conservation programs that we might develop. There are other, so there's an alternative conservation program in the management plan that there may be one provider left in that program in all of the AMAs. So perhaps that's a program that we could edit, update, make more functional, and make more approachable and relevant to different providers. So there's a lot of conversation left to be had here. We've brought up a lot of issues that we'll need to consider having additional conversations about for this particular group. I really do appreciate you all being here and participating and providing all of this feedback. This has been really productive and helpful. So I do want to thank you for all of that and for the time that you're spending and in both attending these meetings and considering these issues. So we do have a full work group meeting on the 19th. There is another ag subgroup meeting on April 6th that will be focusing on agricultural data. I want to point out that the turf meeting on the 27th, that date has changed. That was originally posted for the end of March. We're delaying that meeting a little bit, so please do note that date for the turf meeting, April 27th, that's a different date than was originally posted. So that April 27th date is the correct date for that meeting now. And does anybody else have any last-minute questions before we close out here? Ooh, sure. And these are all available on our public meetings calendar on our website. The agendas are available, will be available on that public meetings calendar, and we also post webinar information on that calendar. So, any questions before we close out? Great. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you again for all of your feedback and your help throughout this process. We will hopefully see you on the 19th. Thanks.